Welcome, everyone. My name is Jen McCann, and I'm with the University of Rhode Island Coastal Resources Center and also Rhode Island Sea Grant. And we'd like to welcome you to the 18th Ronald C. Baird Sea Grant Symposium called Climate Change Effects on Recreational Fishing and Boating. And tonight we are on the Fishinar Session 1, Experiencing Climate Change in the Field. What does it mean? The purpose of this session is to hear from our recreational anglers and boaters about their experiences with the changing climate and better understand the science behind some of these changes. We'd love to hear your stories as well. So again, I'm with Rhode Island Sea Grant and the Coastal Resources Center at URI. And part of what we'd also like to know, aside from these great stories and experiences, is, what are some of the information and research needs or gaps that you have on this topic? And also, what are some potential opportunities and concerns that come to mind when you think about climate change? So we would use this information for future events, as well as basically future events. So before I pass it off to Dave, I'm going to ask you all to stay muted if you're not speaking or on a panel. If you have a question, we'd love to hear from you. You're welcome to put it in the chat question. We will have Q&A for both panels. And so if you would like to ask a question, you're welcome to use the virtual hand, or again, put it in the chat that you would like to ask a question or share a story. And the moderators for each session, along with Dave and myself, will help to keep the conversation going. This is recorded. So in case you want to watch it again or share this event with your friends, it will be on our website very soon. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Dave.
Hey, thanks, Jen. I really appreciate your work on this and your team. Rhode Island Sea Grant, Coastal Resource Center, URI Graduate School of Oceanography has been great. No one pays this much attention to recreational fishing, and this is a session on climate impacts on recreational fishing and boating. So thank you, URI and Jen, for focusing on this. There are a lot of other people engaged to participate in this evening. One of them is the Rhode Island Saltwater Anglers, and I'll be introducing Greg Vespi, their executive director. And I know Jen will be introducing Willie Goldsmith from the American Saltwater Guides Association, two organizations that I happen to be on their board of directors. But the other folks participating in this include Ocean Conservancy, Orsted, the Nature Conservancy, and a host of others. So this is really a community effort to really try to get to this issue of addressing climate change as it impacts fishing and boating. And to do that, there are sort of four key findings that we were leading to. We would love to know, out of not just this session, but the whole three that we'll be having, first of all, what climate impacts are boaters and anglers experiencing? And we're going to find that out tonight. And Greg is going to lead us through a portion of that. The second thing is, how have anglers and boaters adapted to these climate impacts so far? And we're going to sort of get into that a little bit in this session, but our next session, April 13th, will clearly focus. The anglers will actually be talking about how they're targeting those species and some of the tactics and strategies that they're using. The third thing is that there are actions that the offshore wind industry, environmental organizations, government organizations are implementing to accommodate some of these climate impacts we're experiencing. We hope to learn what some of those are. And lastly, boaters and anglers need a greater awareness, and we like to hopefully come up with some ways that we can spread the gospel, educate people about climate impacts and how to adapt to them, and what kind of programs that we should have moving forward. So that said, those are like the big parameters, the things we hope to find out. So it's my honor tonight to introduce Greg Vesby, who is Executive Director of the Rhode Island Saltwater Anglers. He took the helm at the end of last year and has done an outstanding job in the area of fish advocacy in particular. And just a week or so ago, came off of the New England Saltwater Fishing Show. This is the first major show post-COVID, and it was a great success in terms of the number of attendants and the vendors that attended it. So Greg has been a very busy guy. He's going to lead us through a discussion with anglers and boaters as to what impacts they are experiencing. I've talked way too much. So Greg, a pleasure to have you tonight.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David. So I've really been looking forward to tonight's discussion. Our panel that we've have tonight not only spends a great deal of time on the water actually fishing, but is also very dialed in with the New England fishing community at large. And I think that's going to also have we're going to get their perspective based not only what they themselves personally have caught, but what they see and what they hear from other anglers in their region. So I'm really looking forward to that, and hopefully you are too. What I want to do first is if we could just have each of our panelists just briefly let folks know kind of the area in New England that they tend to fish, and just a little bit of their background, that would be great. So Captain Abby Schuster, can you start off with letting us know who you are?
Yeah, hi, thanks for having me. I'm so happy to be here. I'm Abby Schuster. I own Kismet Outfitters. We're based out of Martha's Vineyard. It's a fly fishing guide service. And then I have a fly shop in Edgartown as well. I grew up fishing out here on the vineyard in Connecticut, New England waters. And yeah, I'm lucky to have fished it my whole life, and now I get to guide it. So it's pretty cool.
Thanks, Abby. Todd, can you jump in next? Todd, come in, Todd.
Todd, you're muted.
Strike one. Okay, so I'm Todd Carrera. I write a newspaper column and an internet blog called The Fish Rap Writer, and I'm a very fortunate fisherman because I lived a good part of my life on Block Island, and since I moved to the mainland, I've been very lucky to meet a lot of fishermen and women, and I get to write about them. So most of my fishing is inshore, salt ponds, skinny waters, a lot of kayak fishing. And when Greg is nice enough, I get to go fish the deep water and try to catch cobia. So thank you.
Very good. Thanks, Todd. Joe, can you let us know your background?
Sure. Thanks, Greg. Grew up not too far from here in Connecticut. In Niantic, I worked at JB Tackle, which a lot of people are familiar with, not too far away, all through high school, and then and on their charter boats, and then came to URI for marine affairs and never left. So since then, I was been working on some charter boats. Had my own boat I ran charters with out of Snug Harbor for a while, and I joined the Brewers Group years ago, which became Safe Harbor. And now I'm the regional vice president for Rhode Island for Safe Harbor. So I manage the group of marinas here in Rhode Island. And so I've been fishing as a strong passion of mine, but also work in the industry, and I've been in the marina business for about 10 years there.
Great. Thanks very much, Joe. Do we have Mike with us now? Has he made it onto the screen?
I am.
Awesome.
Hey guys, I'm Mike Wade. I'm the owner of Watchell Outfitters in Rhode Island, Westerly, South County area. I've been fishing that area for quite a few years, about 25 years. I actually grew up in Long Island. I was fortunate to live on the water there most of my life, and fish this area inshore and offshore. Excited to see some of the new things that are happening, and happy to be here.
Great. Awesome. So I think what I will do is, just like the weather in New England, every year in New England fishing always brings a few different things. There's always an occasional anomaly, but what we want to try to talk about tonight is what we're seeing 3, 5, 10-year trends, what we actually feel are trends. So I guess if we're going to start with trends and maybe talk about some biomass shifts, black sea bass is probably the perfect way to start. A couple years ago, you could, 10 years ago, you could win a tournament with a 2.5 pound black sea bass. Nowadays, right, I don't even know if you'd even retain one if you were in a sea bass tournament at that size. Mike, can you just start? What have you been seeing with black sea bass over those, say, last 10 years, and the sizes and the focus?
Well, in a 3 to 5 year period, I think it even began before that, where in the beginning we had, this mass amount of small fish that came into the area. A lot of people had no idea what they were. Customers were coming into the store. Hey, I caught this. Is it a grouper? What's going on? And as we progressed over the years, it became a very much targeted fish. And those fish really begin to take hold and basically created some problems, if you will, because they were basically eating us out of house and home. We really saw a big difference in, the crabs, the lobsters. It really changed the dynamics of Block Island Sound and specifically, Watch Hill area. I think I looked at some maps a few years back, and there were huge biomasses, and they basically said that the black sea bass live in, the area of Block Island and Block Island Sound. So our customers were really starting to target them with fluke. Pretty easy to catch. When you weren't catching fluke, they became a bycatch. People started eating them, and really it just kind of took off from there.
Todd, inshore, can you have you noticed the same thing with black sea bass dominating some of the inshore fisheries now?
Absolutely. And I think, as Mike alluded to, in the beginning, they were, once you got past the what is this factor, they became sort of a nuisance in the fact that when I was around Narragansett or up by the lighthouse looking for stripers, I kept, you come up with black sea bass, and at first it's like, it's a cool fish and I know they taste good, but it's not what I wanted. But the positive to that is that when the fishing is slow, you carry a jigging rod and you drop over some squid, and you can up your ante and catch some black sea bass, which is a positive. But now they're so prolific. I mean, everybody's heard the lobsterman's tales about the meeting up all the, the juvenile lobsters. They're fun to catch and they taste good, but generally in my world, they're not what I'm looking for, but they have the added bonus of being something to catch.
Abby, how about on the Cape? What's the sea bass story? I know Buzzards Bay is becoming pretty well known, right? For sea bass in the spring.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't really see a ton. I mean, because I mostly do fly fishing.
Right.
So we didn't really see a ton of them until like probably 3 years ago. I mean, you would hear people catching them all the time. But in the last like 3 or 4 years, we're getting them on like floating line now. It's crazy. I mean, in the rips where there's so much current and stuff. But even like this fall, I was fishing, guiding, and we saw this huge blitz, and like we ran over because it looked exactly like bonito. They were like kind of dolphining, and it was a blitz of black sea bass
on the surface.
And so we're getting them all the time, just even on fly line now, which is pretty crazy. They're all over the place.
Amazing. Joe, how about what you've seen?
Sorry. Yeah, it's pretty wild. I remember growing up, my father ran charters, and black sea bass was a bonus. It was pretty, everybody got pretty excited if you went out for a full day of fluking and you came back with a black sea bass or two. It was a delicacy. It was kind of rare. And so to see it now change and become, like I said, so prolific, the past couple of years, I've started catching them on umbrella rigs and things like that. I've caught them pulling wire. And I had never seen that before. So kind of similar to what Abby was saying, not only are we seeing a lot of them, they seem to be so thick in places that they're hitting methods that traditionally never would have caught them.
Yep. No, I can remember 20 years ago, if you needed a black sea bass, we would get them grouper fishing off the Carolinas. But now our fishery here is superior in terms of size and quality of sea bass from what I've seen as well. So that's definitely one of the biomasses that seems to, from what I hear in the Carolinas, that's literally not only do we have more sea bass, but it seems as if the biomass has shifted where they're now getting the occasional sea bass, but not to the extent that they once were. Scup, kind of the same things, Todd. Like, seems like Scup bigger and bigger every year now, right? Seems like with tournaments, you know, a two pounder now, you need that to even be in the running, it would seem to me. How about, what have you seen with Scup, Todd?
Scup's not something, you know, I don't normally target Scup. I haven't hit them real hard since my son Miles was younger. We used to take them off the rocks and, you know, down the end of the Narrow River and catch them down there. But they are definitely everywhere. And I think, you know, I think you see more people fishing for them farther up the bay. But when you get into the Scup, they're obviously good eating if you have the right recipe. But and the sizes have definitely increased, and that may be a sign of an increasing amount of bait in the water too, which is, you know, I know that's a conversation for tonight, but there's clearly enough bait to support a much larger size of Scup, given the fact that they're, you know, the predators are all over them. They're definitely a sacrificial fish.
Yep, Mike, I'm going to jump back over to you again. What's the Scup story where you are?
Definitely seeing some larger sizes. You know, in the beginning, you know, they were everywhere, but they weren't nearly the sizes that we're seeing. And really, even with my customers coming in, if, you know, it's just a very easy for me to set them up and say, okay, hey guys, you're taking your kids fishing, go to this location, you know, set down some baits, and basically it's just lock and load all day. Even a company, New England Science and Sailing, over in you know, Stonington area, they actually have a Scupzilla contest that's a few years old now. Really exciting for the kids, but again, very, very prolific all over the place. You know, we have fish to 4 pounds, it seems like. I mean, they're huge, so
Yep.
Much bigger.
And they seem like they're coming in fairly early in the spring, right? And holding in almost as long as the Todd in the fall.
Absolutely, absolutely. They're not going away as quickly as they did in the past. So they're extending through that season. So as fluke is kind of tapering, we're still catching very large, you know, Scup.
Yep. Joe, I know it's not the exciting offshore fishery, but any perspective on Scup, Joe, with your clients and out of the marina?
Yeah, no, it's funny. We see a ton of Scup around the marina. You know, one thing I didn't really notice that much growing up, but I've noticed more recently is I'll be walking on those cement docks at our Warwick facility where I was for a long time at Coesit there, and you'll hear it. It sounds like, you know, like parrotfish down south, and you hear the Scup chewing on the barnacles on the side of the docks. And you see them, you know, good size one, keeper size Scup. They're just swimming around the docks and chewing on the side of them. And I've noticed that, you know, maybe anecdotally, but more and more over the years. So it's great. People at the dock, they have a lot of fun catching them right at their slip.
I'm amazed at guys using diamond jigs for codfish offshore, that they'll pull up some absolute monster Scup. You know, I don't think they're trying to eat the whole diamond jig, but they must be pecking at the treble, you know, or whatever they have at the bottom of it, because yeah, it's been amazing. Abby, the Scup, what's the story up in further north with Scup? Is that, I know it's not a fly target, but what are you seeing or hearing?
No, we don't target them a ton. I wish we did, because I'd look like the best guide ever, because they're definitely around. But people come in the shop all the time, and with their kids, I always send them out, and they come back just so happy because they're always there. And I've heard the same thing on the docks or the rocks, them just eating. But yeah, there's some big fish, and they're definitely around. We were seeing them too, like on the edge of the flats this year, which is pretty interesting. Usually you're not seeing them on the flats, but yeah, they're kind of exploring, they're kind of expanding, I guess.
Yeah.
Cool.
So we'll get to a new one, which is, so I grew up in Jersey, and if you went fluke fishing in New Jersey, you were going to catch a lot more sea robins than just about anything. But the 20 years when I got here in Rhode Island, really fairly rare to nail a sea robin. But boy, I can't say that anymore. And I think we've got a picture, right, of one of those big sea robins we talked about, maybe for, I think that not only are we seeing them up here, but some particularly large ones. And I wanted to see, has anybody felt that it's actually become a fish? Yeah, there's a good size sea robin on the right there. That one's got to go almost 4 pounds. That's one of the larger ones I've ever seen here in New England. But has anyone felt, Todd, people, sea robins becoming actually a targeted species, not just the random biocasts, as the frequency and numbers have increased locally? What are you seeing?
I don't know that they're specifically targeted with the people that I fish with, but I, for the first time since I was commercial fishing when I was much younger, you know, they always went overboard. That was never something you kept. But now you'll see guys in kayaks, you know, off of Newport, catch a couple and keep them because now people are eating them. But, you know, 2 or 3 years ago, they were right back over the side. No one kept them. But it's not something I would target. I haven't eaten one yet, but I know a lot of guys do keep them now.
Right. I can remember the old days. It was called the Jersey swing. You did like a figure 8 with it on the party boats. And if you did it just right, the sea robin would separate off the hook without having to be dealt with. But I think nowadays, they're fabulous in a bouillabaisse, and there's a lot of recipes. Joe, have you guys, anybody at the marinas or anything, starting to actually bring sea robins home as an intended species?
You know, I don't know if enough people are educated on them. You know, they're certainly around quite a bit. But when I was working at the tackle shop, we had a fish market. Again, this is going back about 18, 20 years ago. But there was, you know, at that point, we were bringing in a lot of sea robins from a fish net, from a pound net that was out there. And we were starting, you know, there was an effort being made to teach people how to fillet them, and that they're actually, there is good meat on them. So I don't know if people are targeting them, but I have ate them, and they're you have to have the jumbos. They have to be big enough because it's kind of a strange cut of meat you get off it. Yeah. But hopefully it's an underutilized species that people will get more tuned in with.
Mike, how about you? What are you seeing with sea robins down your way?
I think it's similar for me. I don't really see people, you know, coming into the store specifically wanting to target them. I do have quite a few people that keep them. They bring them to the store, and you're right, people are learning how to fillet them. It's becoming an addition to their catch. The other thing is it's a very cool looking fish. So, you know, even myself, you know, over time, it's like, you know, you'll see those big wings, and they're really very cool looking. So definitely more and more, not so much a target, but definitely people keeping them and filleting them.
Great. Abby, anybody sea robins making it up there?
Yeah, definitely. A lot. I think On the Water had a recipe a few years ago for them. And ever since then, people have been coming to the shop. I haven't eaten one yet, but they apparently are delicious because a lot of people have come in and told me about how they eat them. And they're pretty big. Like, well, I do a lot of flats fishing up here, and we'll see them cruising the flats. These like big orange balls, more and more and bigger. So, yeah.
Yeah, I know in Rhode Island, there's places now where that will actually start to affect the inshore spring squid fishery. In the old days, the squid wouldn't really leave until the stripers and the bluefish used to be what would kind of end the Rhode Island squid run. But now when these big schools of spawning sea robins arrive, they seem to be aggressive enough that the squid don't care to stick around if they come in any numbers. So I know seems like that's been the case. I want to just take a minute. So, you know, a lot of us here fish and we go out and we target fish for fun. But I also want to recognize that, and of course we eat fish that we choose to eat, but there is a whole segment in Rhode Island and New England that essentially people are fishing for food, whether we call it sustenance fishing or, you know, something to that effect. And has anybody noticed that these new species seem to, I guess one of the upsides, right, is that there's no size limit on sea robins. And so that allows for, right, no, you know, people that want food can go out ahead and catch them. Has anyone noticed kind of our shoreline fishermen taking advantage of any of these new species? That's an open question. No?
I absolutely have, especially at the lighthouse. The guys coming in, getting sandworms and such. You know, some of the stories that we've heard is just like we were talking about earlier about blitzing, you know, black sea bass. We have actually had similar situations around the lighthouse where they'll pin fish up into the coves, and the guys will load up on them. And you know, they're an unregulated fish, so they're basically keeping just about all of them, but they're throwing away the small ones and keeping the big ones. So definitely a rise in them, you know, for food, and those guys keeping them. A lot of them, you know, different areas, but the lighthouse is definitely the biggest.
Yeah, I know. I've certainly seen it along Fort Adams and then at Sakonnet, you know, that area off the jetties, where folks are catching fish that a few years ago they wouldn't have caught. And because they're not regulated, the nice thing is that they can take home what they need or want for food, and right, they don't have to worry about measuring or counting. So that
We're seeing it on the island a lot too. A lot of people from the docks. It's also been a really cool kind of way to see like a lot of kids getting involved and people that weren't necessarily getting involved in fishing before, just because it's so accessible and there's so many of them, and the whole like keeping it and that whole, it adds a whole another element. But yeah, we're definitely seeing that.
Abby, I'm going to keep you on the screen. Let's talk kind of the opposite. Let's go exotic. And I know from what I've heard on the Cape, there's been a fishery that's developed over the last, say, 10 years that would include maybe Spanish mackerel and king mackerel. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. I heard of them for the past years, but I think the first one we caught was maybe 4 years ago in the fall, 4 or 5, 4 years ago. And we were in the rips, and all of a sudden just like a huge hit. And then we kind of like dragged this thing in, and it was a king mackerel. It was crazy. It was kind of a bad guide moment on my part, because I was like, oh my God. I was so surprised that we got one, and it was really big. And then now they're more common. It's definitely not like a huge, as big of a deal anymore. But we're seeing them definitely in the rips in the fall, starting maybe like the end of August, kind of when the bonito move in, we're starting to see them all the way through till the end of October, really.
Neat.
Yeah, it's cool.
Yeah. Anybody else? Joe, have you seen king mackerel in Spanish? Or I know you go even further off and catch some other things.
Yeah, it's funny. I've seen, you know, people talking about the Spanish and the kings, you know, up Abby's way. I haven't caught any down here yet. I do a decent amount of Albie and bonita fishing, which is a lot of fun. But I haven't gotten any kings or Spanish mackerel here. But like we, you know, we had talked earlier a little bit about, you know, in the kind of, you know, the mid shore, we're starting to call it now. So, you know, offshore, maybe not as far as the canyons, but in the shipping lanes in that area, you know, we're seeing more wahoo and mahi. Mahi has certainly been around here for a long time, but the wahoo seem to be increasing in frequency, at least in my lifetime. So starting to see some more of this kind of exotic species in that realm.
Neat. Todd, any experience with Spanish kings or wahoo?
I have not seen them around where I am here in South County, but a few summers ago, I was down in the Cape with doing a Hobie kayak event, and we were albie fishing, and which is hard enough, trying to hook an albie from a kayak. And those kings came through, and like Abby, the guy next to me pulled one up, and I kind of looked at him and said, I don't know what that is. And he was rigged. That gentleman was prepared for them. It was the first time I'd fished that area of the Cape, and they were amazing, and a huge fight, and turned boats around. I mean, it was really, really exciting. A couple guys caught them, not me, of course, because I didn't know what they were, but super cool. And I know last summer I heard a few reports of them in the southern part of the bay, down, you know, the Newport area, but I hope they come around because that's a pretty exciting fishery.
Mike, how about you? Have you seen anything your way?
Not so much on the Spanish mackerel or kings. We do have quite a few guys coming in with wahoo. We had a very big offshore season last year. A lot of the guys dragging stuff in the lanes really came up with quite a few of them. Unusual fish, overall, but the quantities are definitely increasing, just like we have with the mahi-mahi. One of the most unusual catches I think I've seen over the last 3 or 4 years is a gentleman at one of the breachways, and he called me on the phone one day and wanted to know if I was still open and if I could stay. because he had a world record fish is what he called it. And I was like, well, what is it? How big is it? And he says, oh, it's like 50 pounds. And my first response is, that's not a world record striped bass. I mean, that's a fantastic catch. And I'll stay if you want to bring it by, and I'll weigh it for you, take pictures. And he says, no, it's a black drum. And I was like, a black drum? And my first response was, do you even know what a black drum looks like? And, he was, adamant about it being one. So I ended up staying, and he sure enough brought in a 50, I think it was 51 or just over a 50-pound black drum. And we weighed it for the record for Rhode Island. And I'm not sure they had it on there. So it was listed under the notable catch series.
Right.
But very exciting.
Yeah.
Very exciting, unusual.
How about any redfish? Have anybody ever?
I haven't seen reds. No, I hear about them, but I haven't seen them in the store or have had any customers bring them. But black drum, it was a very unusual fish.
Yeah, no, that is. Jersey, I know, has an actual targeted fishery now for black drum.
Oh,
seems like they're starting to push up as well. It'll be interesting to see if that starts to build. How about some of the lesser known miscellaneous? We've always got like the northern kingfish and the puffer fish. Are those kind of becoming more common now? Or triggers, right? That's another one we could throw in. I'll kind of leave
all of those are coming up for us. I'm not sure if that was directed at me or not, but
yep.
all of those fish are increasing. And over the last few years, puffers, which used to be Long Island Sound and the Great South Bay, which is where I grew up originally, mass amounts of them. And then now we have the kings coming in, which is just within this last year that I've even heard of them. I kind of thought those fish were basically wiped out many years ago, but they seem to be moving up in our direction, further than the bays of Long Island or New Jersey areas, which is we would go out of Captree. So that was an area for us.
Hey, Greg, just a time check. We got about 5 minutes and then questions. And I know that Todd had some great slides of some striped bass, and he has a couple of theories about the striped bass hanging around. And I know Joe wanted to talk a little bit about offshore fishing too.
Yeah, and weather. So, all right, Todd, why don't you do that? And then Joe, I want to get in about weather changes besides fish species. So let's do that, and that'll be perfect, I think.
Well, basically, as I alluded to, I do a lot of fishing in shallow water and salt ponds and from the kayak in intro waters. And one thing I've noticed over the years, I take pretty diligent records of weather conditions and time and tide, that kind of thing, and air and water temperatures. And while it's not highly scientific, because I do miss a little now and then, but the waters are definitely warmer longer. And what I'm seeing over the last 5+ years is that there's more bass staying for the winter. And it's not uncommon in a normal winter to catch a few bass, in December and January. But I have notes from December, 2 weeks before Christmas, where the seagulls are just pounding the surface and picking up peanut bunker, and the bass are flying out of the water like it's July, and it's a week and a half before Christmas. A few years ago on December 11th, I caught 34 striped bass up to 36 inches, and one of my notes said, "Birds, fish, and mayhem." And I think the point is that what I'm seeing is there's more fish that are not migrating south. The fish are bigger. I think there's more bait for them to eat. If you look at some of those pictures, those 4 pictures are all December or later. Big fat stomachs, big healthy fish, not the racers that you normally see in January, or February and March, where they're real thin and they're starving for the river herring to come in. Look at that top left picture. That boat's 32 inches wide, and that picture is probably the first week of January. And even just this year on New Year's Day weekend, I got 17 stripers up to 35 inches, and one of them parted a 20-pound leader. And before anybody brings up, it wasn't my knot, it's usually the knot that fails. That fish parted a 20-pound leader, and I was in 4 feet of water in January, because the water's warm and there's a lot of bait and there's a lot of fish, and it's good in some ways. It's good for a guy like me. you know, God forbid I go over, it's nice to know the water's a little bit warmer than it normally is in February or March when I'm out there. You know, most of my fishing is wintertime or, you know, late fall, early spring, but I don't think it's a good sign. I think it's good for fishing, but I think there's a soft negative here that word's going to get around when people realize how many fish are staying. I don't think it's healthy. I think nature needs a nap. I don't think it's healthy that these fish are staying. This December, I was fishing with Tom Hood, and we caught, this is maybe the second or third week of December, we were catching stripers in a salt pond with sea lice on them. They were coming in from offshore. They weren't going south. They weren't going to Block Island like they did when I was a kid.
Yep.
You know, they're staying in close. And I think the short story is, I think if this is the trend, I think that overwintering population of fish is going to get pounded when the people figure it out, and the access is going to take a hit, and those fish are going to take a pounding.
Yeah. No. All right. Yeah. Joe, before you came on earlier, I had talked to Abby about, it seemed like wind has become more and more of an issue for fishing, and not just when there's a storm, but just in general. Can you talk a little bit with your experience at the marinas and dealing with all the boaters and what you're seeing offshore? Has it gotten windier?
Yeah, you know, it's tough to say, you know, for me, it's so anecdotal. You know, I always wonder if it's just everybody always complains about the weather every year, but it does seem like the last couple of years, we had more issues with not only wind, but also, you know, some really unpredicted storms. These pictures that Abby just put up for us are pictures I took about 3 or 4 years ago at our Coesit yard. I was the GM there for a long time, and this was a no-name storm. This was a Halloween storm, and I say that because there is a nasty storm almost every year around Halloween, around that last week of October, beginning of November. And you know, the interesting thing is we always get hung up on storms with names. You know, as soon as there's a hurricane coming that the media is given a name to, everybody kind of goes nuts. But these no-name storms by far have done way more damage to the marinas than anything else I've seen. And this was an example. Again, this was October 29th. I think it was 2017, and we saw over $1 million worth of damage that night, between boat sinking and infrastructure. And the big thing that I've seen there was not only the wind, but also the direction. We have a big exposure there to the southeast. We have a lot of miles of fetch, and you know, historically we didn't see as much southeast wind. It wasn't the worst exposure. In the winter we saw a lot of northwest. In the summer we saw a lot of southwest. But now we've seen, you know, these southeasterly components to storms in the winter. You know, we had a strong storm that knocked over a few boats at a property not too long ago, and that was a really strong south wind. It was a warm, you know, a warm air temperature, and to see that in the winter, I thought was bizarre. Yeah. So I've noticed that.
All right, Abby, I think we'll close it out with you. How's the wind on the Cape? Other than the first hour in the morning, does it seem like it kicks up, or what's the story there?
Yeah, it's always windy here. It's crazy. And then, I mean, really, like the fall, it's just, when people say, oh, is it going to be windy? Yes, it's going to be windy. Every day is going to be windy. But our storms have gotten worse too. And it's funny, Joe said like the no-name storms are the worst. There was a storm this fall around Halloween, actually, that was just going to be like 40 knots, you know, canceled my trip, whatever. But it actually we clocked 97 miles an hour, which is crazy wind. And that brings in a ton of, you know, ocean and water and swell, and all the parking lots are underwater. The shop, which is inland, had like 8 inches of water in front of it just from rain. But I live over on Chappaquiddick. I don't know who's familiar with Martha's Vineyard, but it's an island off Martha's Vineyard. It's 547 feet. It's not that big of a deal, but you have to take a boat back and forth, and they just proposed changing the ramps to the ferry because it's had to be canceled so many times in the last few years because the water's rising with the storms, and their storms are so more frequent now. So it's definitely, there's action being taken, but it's crazy.
Well, I'd love to keep going, but I have a feeling we've got other panelists and time. So Dave, is it time for us to call it a session?
I think we're, I don't know if we have any questions in the queue. I know that there was one that I saw, Jen, about the type of bait around in winter. In other words, we're even seeing huge amounts of bait in the summer, in the peak fishing season, bringing in a lot of the species that haven't been around in abundance. You know, bluefin tuna being one of those, catching giants again a mile off of Scarborough and Narragansett Beach, but also the school bite has been great. I'll be on my way to Block Island with my charter boat, and I'll be driving by Narragansett. And in the mornings this summer, you know, pods of dolphin, 200, 300, 400. And this was really very, very uncommon, those huge, large pods, you know, in close to shore. And it's a bait issue, and it carries right over into the winter. So I'd just like to ask Todd, because we did have a question from John here, and I know we had one response. What kind of bait are you seeing in the winter that those striped bass are going after, Todd?
Some that look like silver sides. I'm definitely seeing very, very late in the season, even to Christmas or later, peanut bunker. I've seen a few blitzes of them. You kind of see the water start to move like it's summertime, and all of a sudden there's a whole pile of peanut bunker. Not always bass under them or under them, but I'm definitely seeing the peanut bunker. River herring, of course, you know, some do stick around. The older ones will stick. I mean, the younger ones will stick around, but mostly silver sides and the peanut bunker.
Great. Jen, are there any other questions that you see there in the chat?
No, I see several stories, and I don't know if others want to share some of their stories. I see Brian Crawford is commented. Brian, do you want to unmute and share something?
Hi, Jen. Yeah, I've seen a lot of changes. I go out fishing in Narragansett Bay a lot. I don't go out into the nearshore waters. But certainly in the Bay, I've seen changes where, you know, in terms of more and bigger, you know, size Skup, in my opinion. I don't know whether that's because of the management regulations or because of climate change, but certainly a bigger Skup is what I'm finding in terms of my catch. And then also sea robins in certain times of the year. I've been trying to catch Scup, and I wind up with a lot of sea robins. And initially I started throwing them back in the water, but then I said, well, I'm going to try, eating some of these. And the bigger ones, you know, the meat on the back, you know, the back of the sea robins actually isn't too bad if you can get by the kind of the slimy, you know, they're not scaled fish and everything. But we're clearly seeing changes, I think, in Narragansett Bay. A lot more, even in the Bay, a lot more black sea bass in certain times of the year in the Bay. You know, obviously they're not legal keeping size, but I've found that I've been catching a lot more black sea bass juveniles that I have to throw back, even if I'm targeting sea bass. So as a recreational fisher, that's kind of, you know, in the Bay, that's some of my experiences. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. I know that Mike Wade had an interesting story about sea level rise. Mike, in your shop, which is located right alongside the Pawcatuck, you've seen enhanced sea level rise. Maybe you could comment on that and what happened this summer.
Well, some of the things that I'm seeing, Dave, is just the frequency of it. I've taken steps over the years to actually have sump pumps put in because of it, to try to, fend that off. We did have a pretty good flood a while back. It really didn't have anything to do with power outages or anything of that. It was just excessive wind, heavy tide, and then the water level rising within my store. My store is very close to the river, and believe it or not, it used to be there was a basement in my building, which is a small building. And in that basement, there actually used to be a garage drive-in. So they even had it cut down, and over the years, they actually built it up. So I do see a much more frequent problem with that. The other area that is very noted for the westerly Watchell area is, believe it or not, the Watchell Harbor. So the Watchell Harbor is very close to the waterline. You've got the yacht clubs that sits just outside of the water on, they rebuilt it a few years ago to raise it. But that parking lot is very often, flooded. We actually had fish behind me, and then in the Watchell Harbor, there were actually fish in the parking lot, which was just an amazing thing to see. I've never seen it before. Bait fish, little bluefish. So definitely a big change, over the last, I'd say 5 or 6 years in frequency that we're seeing much higher levels.
Thanks, Mike. Jen, anything else look
Yeah,
interesting?
no, I think it's good. I think that's a great segue to the next panel, trying to and I would suggest if Greg, your panel could stay on, show us your face, so because we're hoping that this will be a little bit more of an interactive conversation between panel 2 and panel 1. So with that, I'd like to introduce Pam Rubinoff, also at the University of Rhode Island Coastal Resources Center and Rhode Island Sea Grant. So Pam?
Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Dave and Greg. Thank you for facilitating the conversation amongst all of the different practitioners here. And it's very interesting to see these on-the-ground experiences. So the focus of this panel is really going to look at trying to understand those impacts from the scientific perspective. And so we have 2 panelists that will share some information to help put the stories in context that we all just heard, and we can then have some more discussion. So I'm going to let Willie introduce himself and then hand it over to John, who will start to give us some insight on why we're seeing more sea bass and exotic species, why some of the fish are bigger, and why, what are the reasons for the fish staying longer in the winter. So go for it, Willie.
Thanks, Pam. Thanks so much for having me tonight. Thrilled to be here. My name is Willie Goldsmith. I'm the Executive Director of the American Saltwater Guides Association. For those of you who don't know ASGA, we are a coalition of recreational fishing guides, small businesses, and conservation-minded recreational anglers. We have the opportunity to work a lot with Greg and Rich at RISA, so it's great to see them on here as well. I now live in Washington, D.C., but grew up fishing in Massachusetts on the other side of Cape Cod, up in the Gulf of Maine, working in bait shops and on boats up there. And certainly, we've seen our share of changes on the water up there as well. And it's really interesting to hear kind of the perspective of folks down on the other side of Cape Cod. And as I'm sure John will mention, Cape Cod is one of those big, what we call biogeographic barriers. So, the Outer Banks and Cape Hatteras is another one. It's kind of these big places in the ocean where you typically see different species assemblages and kind of different communities. And what we've seen with climate change in recent years is really, some changes there with some new species moving into new areas. And I think what I'm going to do is, John has done a huge amount of research on climate impacts on fisheries. And I think he's going to open up with kind of, some big picture views on what's been happening. And then I'll jump in with some examples and would love to kind of have a back and forth with the first panel and other folks in the audience. So John, I'll pass it over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Willie. I lived in North Carolina for 10 years, and the past hour, I felt like I was back in North Carolina hearing about king mackerel and Spanish mackerel, a little bit about cobia, and then striped bass in winter. Those are all fisheries that we talked about a lot in North Carolina. And I think that's telling, right? Here we are, Southern New England, talking about fisheries that are common in the mid-Atlantic and Southeast United States. And I think, that's climate change. Climate is changing, temperatures are warming, species are moving, productivity is changing. So from a scientific perspective, everything that I just heard makes sense. And so when you think about climate change and fisheries, there's two main sort of effects. One is changing distribution, and one is changing productivity. We heard a little bit today about shifting distributions, but it's really a little more complicated than that. It's changing distributions, and distribution changes can involve shifts, population moving from one place to another. It can involve expansions, a population expanding into new areas, and it can involve contractions, population leaving an area. And those differences, it's words, but those differences actually make a big difference in terms of how you manage a shift versus how you manage an expansion are very different things. So there's nuances in the changing distributions that we heard about earlier. Changing productivity, maybe it's a concept a little harder to sort of understand. And so the way I like to describe it is the Hare family lineage has been decreasing in productivity. My grandfather was one of 8. I'm one of 3, and my wife and I have 1 son. And so productivity is a number of offspring per parent. So my grandfather was 2. The productivity of his parents were 2 per. My parents, it was 1.5 per, and my wife and I are 1/2 per. So our productivity has been decreasing. Flip side, productivity of some species is increasing, productivity of other species is decreasing. And so winter flounder, a lot of scientific evidence, productivity of winter flounder in southern New England is decreasing. I think we heard some excellent points of view about the productivity of sea bass is increasing. So changes in distribution, changes in productivity are 2 key pieces of climate change effects on fisheries. And then the other, the more complicated, sort of the messier one is we're just reshuffling the deck. All of these different species changes, interaction between silverside and striped bass and menhaden and striped bass, and what are the king mackerel eating? We're changing forage, which is changing predators, which is changing how we are interacting with them. So we're reshuffling the deck on ecosystems, and that's where it becomes very hard to sort of predict what's going to happen in the future. But I come back to the point that I made right at the beginning is, I think we know where we're going. Climate change is making the ecosystems in southern New England much more like the Mid-Atlantic Bight, New Jersey, Maryland, Delaware, and North Carolina. And so that's where we need to look to see what we're going to be experiencing, what you're all going to be seeing on the water, and then the challenges that we're going to be having from a management perspective. So that's just my quick sort of science perspective on the conversation that we just had. And I'll turn it over to you, Willie, for some examples.
Yeah, sure, John. Thanks for kind of setting the stage there and providing some context. And I think I just wanted to give, a few examples of kind of, what we've learned and what kind of some of the science is showing us, both in terms of what we've already seen, but also in terms of trying to project, what we might see moving into the future. And one really helpful way to do that is to think about, those really anomalous warm years that we see. So folks might remember 2012 was an example of a super warm year, and there was all sorts of weird stuff going on that year. I remember I was working on a boat in Gloucester, and we were scrubbing the boat one night, and we looked under the lights, and there were longfin squid everywhere, which we never saw. That was a brand new thing for us. And we got the boat completely covered in squid ink after scrubbing it clean, which was another story in and of itself. But kind of it was a new experience for us. And now 10 years later, we're seeing those kinds of events happening every year. So, sometimes we get a really good snapshot into what the future steady state's going to look like by having these interesting, anomalous warm years. So just kind of something to keep in mind is, you consider, seeing an oddball species one year, could be a sign that in, 10, 15, 30 years, you might end up seeing that more and more. Just a couple of examples of kind of some of the work that's been done. I did my Ph.D. at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science, which does, there are a couple of folks there who do a lot of work on climate change and distribution modeling in particular. And one of the studies that I was involved with down there or that one of my colleagues led, was looking at cobia and really trying to better project how cobia movements could change. I know certainly, you know, Greg has witnessed firsthand that we're seeing species like that moving into southern New England waters. And basically some of the work that was done entailed putting satellite transmitters on cobia, better understanding what types of habitat they preferred, and then running simulations to understand what ocean conditions might look like moving into the future. And what this research found is that the center of cobia distribution right now is off of Virginia and North Carolina during the summer months, but it's predicted that in maybe 30 to 40 years, it's going to shift actually up to New Jersey, and that almost half of the suitable summer habitat for cobia is going to be from New Jersey north. So that would be Long Island Sound, Connecticut, and of course, you know, Narragansett Bay and Rhode Island. So, you know, there's definitely, you know, this is assuming kind of business as usual in terms of climate change, but, you know, we're certainly seeing examples of how these changes might continue to occur. And so that's one example of something that, you know, we're expecting to see. An example of something that we're already seeing, as everybody was mentioning at the outset, there is of course black sea bass, and it's not just in Rhode Island and southern New England. It's also, as I mentioned, kind of over that biogeographic hump and up into the Gulf of Maine. I remember fishing a flounder spreader bar in Cape Ann and catching a sea bass 10 years ago and thinking it was this crazy thing, but I now learned that there are folks up there who go spearfishing and regularly see both black sea bass and tautog. And what's really interesting is that, you know, those fish basically they're eating different things up there. Back to John's point about community composition, they're not having the same, you know, they're not basically making a living the way the fish further to the south do. And that, you know, raises questions. Are these fish full-time residents of the Gulf of Maine? Do they migrate back south? Do we need to manage these fish as a separate stock from the fish, for example, that are in Rhode Island? So there are all sorts of questions like that that really come up in a management context that need to be addressed. So those are some examples of the shifting stocks and the expanding stocks, as John was alluding to, which I think are really the most readily visible changes that we see from climate change. But there's a lot of these other, you know, productivity changes that John was mentioning, and also new species interactions, that reshuffling of the deck that have really important implications for what our fishery is going to look like. So some examples include recruitment, which is basically spawning success. So how good are big fish at making little fish? And there's been evidence both in your guys' backyard down in Narragansett Bay and off Rhode Island and up in the Gulf of Maine that for cod, when water becomes warmer, spawning success goes down and the number of young of year fish diminishes. And so, you know, we heard a lot about how there are more of some fish, but less about how there are less of some fish. And certainly John had mentioned one example with winter flounder. Cod is another example. Lobsters as well in southern New England are another example. And this can reverberate in all levels of the food chain. So sand lance or sand eels, whatever you might call them, obviously a big time forage fish for a lot of species. There's evidence that for them, it's not so much warming water as it is ocean acidification or decrease in pH, which could reduce the ability of their embryos to form. And so that again could have huge ripples throughout the ecosystem. So those are kind of some of these productivity changes. And then lastly, I just want to touch on a couple of examples of this deck reshuffling, these species interactions. I had mentioned these longfin squid showing up in New England, in the Gulf of Maine and northern New England, you know, as another example of kind of a subsistence fishery that's emerged. You know, a lot of folks showing up out there with their, you know, generators and lights and catching squid and having a great time. But that also has further implications. So there was historically a big fishery for a species called northern shrimp or pink shrimp off of Maine. And that fishery really hasn't existed for the past 10 years or so. And it's been thought that one reason for that, and at least recently, has been because a big predator of those northern shrimp has been all of these longfin squid showing up and eating all the shrimp. And so, you know, we're seeing these new changes, you know, with these examples of what you might call climate change winners and climate change losers. And as a result, the community is really changing. And by the same token, with all those black sea bass that are now in the Gulf of Maine, you know, they're exploding. They're growing quickly. They're maturing more early than the fish that you see in off Rhode Island. And one thought might be that because cod are overfished and there aren't as many as them left, these sea bass might be occupying what we call this ecological niche, this new gap in the ecosystem that sea bass are kind of rushing to fill. So I guess what I'm trying to say is there's all these different pieces moving around, but climate change is really kind of the unifying factor that's driving or accelerating a lot of these changes, not only to where fish are, but also, how productive they are and how many of them are available for us to catch. So I think I'll leave it at that. And Pam, not sure if we want to go to the audience for questions, or if you had any questions for us.
Yeah, so wow, thank you both for giving us context to what we heard earlier. I have a couple thoughts here. First, I would love to go over to Jim Turek, who works at NOAA, who had his comment related to jellyfish and ctenophores and fiddler crabs. Jim, can you just give us a little bit more insight on that and how this affects the ecosystem and what we're hearing about for recreational fishing?
Sure. Yeah, so people may not know me, but I work for NOAA's Restoration Center out of the Narragansett office, and I spend most of my time working on restoration of diatomaceous fish, like river herring, shad, and striped bass, and then also spend a lot of time working on salt marshes now, which are also undergoing incredible changes with climate change. And so I just in the chat there, I just put in some species that we've seen drastic increases other than just fish. I mean, I put, for example, there's certainly incredible densities, at least seasonally, that we find in our coastal waters of ctenophores, salps. These are, floating in the water column typically. The fiddler crabs, uka, which had been a mid-Atlantic species, now is in incredible densities in southern New England, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and they're of course moving in high numbers even on the north side of Cape Cod now, but not nearly the densities we have down here. You can go out on marshes around our area now in the summer, and you can see literally an army of fiddler crabs marching across these marshes. And of course, what do? They're part of the system, but they graze on the marsh plain, so they're feeding on the grass, the marsh plant blades. They're also building tunnels, and so they're modifying the marsh substrate. And what's that doing? That's exacerbating the condition of the marsh in our area, because it's mostly organic substrates, and so they're breaking down faster, and it's exacerbated by sea level rise. So we're getting waterlogged marshes, and then also affected by these animals that are moving northward that we've been talking about. So I just wanted to make a point that our habitats are being affected by these warming temperatures. They're bringing in new fauna from the south that we never had here before, and so our marshes are changing substantially. And then I would also mention, like, going back to the migratory fishes that we work on. So what we're seeing now, with river herring runs in general, south of the Cape, the runs and typically have been going decreasing. That we've done a lot of restoration work in southern New England, but what we're seeing is a lot of those runs are not increasing to the extent that I guess we expected. In contrast, some of the herring runs in the north, north of Cape Cod, are still doing relatively well. And so there's definitely a shift in these populations seasonally. And the other thing I would say, when the herring come in the spring, the other challenges we have now is they're coming in a lot earlier. I mean, literally, the runs from the last 20 to 30 years have increased earlier in the season by 3 to 4 weeks. And so the runs are coming in earlier. And then, of course, with precipitation event changes, in general, the Northeast is getting wetter, but we're also having still, drought periods, and we're also having these peak runoff periods. And so what does that do for these herring runs is in very low flow periods, the fish have more of a difficult time, at least in smaller systems where the water level is so low that they may not be able to pass to get to their spawning grounds. And then in contrast with the very high flows, they in essence, they may have trouble passing barriers. They become velocity barriers where there's too much water. And so at any rate, I would just say that, just so folks understand, all these climate changes are occurring not only to these fish populations, but the habitat that support these fish, and then other organisms that also have an influence on these habitats.
Thank
That's
you.
a photo from that I took down in at Town Brook in Plymouth. That was a number of years ago. This is an example of a run that's doing quite well still. It's a very small stream that dumps right in by Plymouth Rock, and it drains out of the Billington Sea, which is about a 385-acre lake, if you're not familiar with it. And so this run in particular is still doing quite well. We've put a lot of effort into we've taken I think 5 or 6 dams out on Town Brook, but I just wanted to point out that here's a system that's essentially in a at least it's got a colder environment. The herring runs on that side of as we move north up the coast are doing better than some of the systems in southern New England.
Well, thank you, Jim, for stepping in, and I didn't even cue you, so thank you very much for stepping up. So I just wanted to, maybe this isn't a good question, but John, you spoke a lot about the differences in how the species are distributed. Our colleagues in the first panel spoke about that. In fact, some of them weren't even managed at this point. Do you have any insight or maybe look in your crystal ball to look in the future? Because these are business people that are looking to the future as well. Any thoughts on management changes that, how does this really affect management?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not a manager, so I'll say that up front. And fisheries management is in the United States is participatory management. So I think all of us have a role to play in management. So I think it's, do we want to sort of advocate to manage these species that are unmanaged? In terms of the crystal ball, I think even if we deal, Willie, you talked about, the emission scenarios, carbon dioxide emission scenarios. Even if we solve the carbon dioxide problem tomorrow, we've baked in climate change for the next couple of decades at least. So, we need to just figure out how we're going to adapt to the changes that are occurring and that will come, because it's going to be part of what we're having to deal with going forward for at least the next several decades.
Great. So yeah, so that's an evolving part, an evolving science and management. And I will just reiterate, as John pointed out, that fisheries management is a participatory management, and so it's wonderful that all of you here are learning and sharing so that could support the management. I'm going to take a question here from the chat from Brian Crawford. Are the herring runs being earlier affected, or is that affecting the overall populations? John?
Yeah, I have to think back to the ASMFC benchmark stock assessment. So I don't think the earlier runs are so much related to population abundance. But it is it's a timing issue in terms of moving from saltwater to freshwater and then freshwater back to saltwater. And, Jim talked about, some of the runs north of Cape Cod are doing quite well. But it's that the southern New England runs, which, are not responding. They're still low. Even though there's been a fair amount of habitat restoration work there, but I don't think abundance I don't think anyone has shown that abundance is tied to run timing.
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to answer, I'm going to share one other comment. I'll get to you, Dave, in a moment. What are the effects of climate change on natural mortality in managed finfish, shellfish stocks for establishing quota allocations for saltwater angling target stocks? Willie or John?
Yeah, I mean, Willie, I'll take that first. And, so, climate-driven changes in natural mortality, typically we do not include that type of information in stock assessments. Most of our stock assessments include either a constant natural mortality or a ramped natural mortality. But we are developing stock assessment models that can take into account more time varying components, bringing in sort of changes in environmental conditions, either through recruitment or growth or maturity or natural mortality, as the question suggested. And so at this point in time, it's not making its way into science or management, but it is something that we're actively working on.
Yeah,
Thank you, John.
I would just add, I think it's a great question, and just like everything else we've talked about, and it's times like these I'm glad I'm not a modeler, because there's so many different kind of levers at which this could be occurring. So is warming water or ocean acidification directly affecting a baby fish? Is it affecting the food and how well the food is doing it? Is it affecting where the food is in relation to where the baby fish is? And like all these different questions you have to kind of consider in concert, and any one of them could have a major impact. And of course, you think of that, trying to separate out the noise of the interannual variability with all of this, with that larger signal. And so I think it's really difficult to tease out, but it's definitely a critical question and something that is could have a really big impact on a lot of these species.
Thank you both. I'm gonna, before I get to Dave, Dave, actually, Dave, why don't you go and then I'll add something else. Dave, you have the question.
Yes, I do. Hey, Willie, this one's for you. I know that many of the guides in the American Saltwater Guides Association target false albacore and bonito. It's an important species for them. And as you know, there's certainly, we have some great years with false albacore in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. Last year wasn't so great, but we've had some epic years actually. And I know this is an important species. What are your thoughts about false albacore? I know that you have interests in doing research in that area too, with false albacore specifically. And what are some of the things that are impacting those two species that you see?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. I think, false albacore or little tunny or whatever you want to call them, they're an incredibly understudied species. There's really not a whole lot that we know. There's been some studies on feeding ecology, but in terms of movements and connectivity, for example, there's a big false albacore population off Florida, and the extent to which, those fish are residential perhaps and do or do not interact with the fish that we see up here in southern New England every late summer, early fall. None of that is really known. I think there are some big questions there. I think with bonito, we've certainly seen some evidence for maybe an expanding range, particularly with the small ones. I mean, this is all anecdotal coming, from me, but I have, charter captains in Maine who will, catch, not tiny, like, between 14 and 18 inch bonito while they're jigging for mackerel or pollock for bait for striped bass. Last year, fishing for bluefin tuna on Stellwagen Bank, we would routinely see schools of small bluefin tuna exploding on 5 to 7 inch baby bonito. So that's definitely become a large kind of area for them to aggregate every summer. In terms of what the impacts are, it's hard to say because frankly we don't know a lot about them to begin with. And so I think the first step is really trying to get a handle on some of those baseline questions, and from there we can get a better handle on what climate impacts might entail.
Thank you, Willie. I'm just going to switch the conversation a little bit. We've heard a lot here about species and temperature and productivity. And we heard our colleagues speak about wind and increased water elevations and tides. So I don't have specific data on this, but the Northeast is experiencing, as you all have said, increased storminess. So as we're hearing increased winds, we're hearing more back-to-back storms, and this information is being actually right now summarized in some of our new assessments. And so stay tuned for that, but it's the data is showing that what you're seeing certainly is accelerating and will continue in the future. The other point of information Mike spoke about on the Pawcatuck and down in Watch Hill westerly, that he's seeing water in his parking lots. He's seeing fish up on shore. Abby, can you just cue up that slide that I sent to you? So over the past 100 years in Rhode Island, we've seen approximately a foot of sea level rise. And a new NOAA report that was just released last month talked about looking to the future. So here we've gotten a foot of sea level rise in the past 100 years, and very good estimates are that we will get another foot, at least another foot, by mid-century. So we're really accelerating our sea level rise due to warming temperatures of the atmosphere and associated with the water. You could see here, this is from My Coast, Rhode Island, and you all could sign up for that and be citizen scientists. And so what we're seeing here are extreme high tides. And we're seeing these at an increasing rate as well. I believe somebody was saying, it seems like since 2010. So since 2010, we're seeing around twice the amount that we were of these extreme high tides. So you could see here in Providence, the issue related to the fish in the parking lot, as Mike was speaking to. And then here, the top one is Watch Hill, the yacht club that Mike also spoke about. So that tide is over a foot greater than mean higher water. So what we're seeing here is a foot to a foot and a half greater than mean higher water. So what does that mean to us is that in the future, by 2050, we're going to be seeing these kinds of tides on a daily level, as opposed to an extreme moon tide or king tide, as we call them. The one below is from Portsmouth, from Prudence Island. And so you could see different aspects of the areas that recreational boaters will have to engage with, from public access to their boats to fishing and the fish being impacted. And we're documenting these throughout the state. So I just wanted to share those images, and in the chat you could look at more of these. So please join our My Coast community science effort on that. So with that, Mike, I'm going to throw it back to you. Does this look familiar to you?
It does. That's a very specific photo of exactly where I was speaking. That water will actually come to a point where it's pretty much the club itself is inaccessible at points. And then if we have storms during those tides, it will go way beyond that. I have a friend of mine that has a deli there, a Bay Street Deli, and he deals with it constantly. He's actually across the street where he has water coming to that location. And he sees it every year. It's building. I can totally see fish swimming there. I've seen it before. They really just go around that little wall to the left of your photo, and it basically is a straight shot into the parking lot. So very good photo. Very good photo.
Yeah, it's I will just say that, so the report from NOAA really has pretty so they've really confirmed, really tightened up their models for 2050, looking at 1 to 1.5 feet here in Rhode Island. So that's actually the good news, because the other models were showing much higher. So, but what it really means is that we, at this point, really need to be looking at the infrastructure that's going to take 30 years to change. And so looking at boat ramps for recreational boating, which are really important, looking at some of these low-lying docks. Many of the old docks are not floating docks. And then even just shoreline access to some of these points is being cut off. So it's something to start to consider from this whole industry. I am going to turn it over. I'm going to just ask if anybody in our first panel has some questions to ask of John or Willie or myself. Isn't there a question that, okay, while you're thinking about that, please do, because we will, we would love, or I will ask Willie and John, do you have any questions of our first panelists in terms of what they're seeing to help document some of the work that you are doing?
Pam, I've got something I can ask them while they're thinking, if they want to. Just as we know that as the water is warming and as the biomasses of some of these fish start to shift northward to maintain their optimal water temperatures, clearly the structures in Rhode Island are not the same, say, as New Jersey and mid-Atlantic areas. So I guess what I'm saying is, are there prediction models that look at, as some of these species, as the temperatures now become acceptable for some of these fish to be in New England, does the bottom structure and the way the New England coast is designed, I guess it would seem to me that some fish are going to benefit even more, because our structures are essentially maybe more what they've always wanted in the first place, whereas other fish might not benefit as well because we don't have the mid-Atlantic coasts, sandy sloping coasts for miles. Is that something you guys have kind of started to look at, or is that reasonable?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start. I mean, it's a fascinating point, right? The coast of southern New England and Gulf of Maine is very different than the coast of Long Island, New Jersey, and you can think of the hard habitat and structure of southern New England as being preferential for black sea bass, and maybe not as good for northern kingfish. And so, but trying to get down into those differences, from a scientific perspective, I don't think we're quite there yet. There are some, Willie talked about sort of models that try to project habitat going forward. There are some models that include bottom habitat, but I don't think they're really focusing on these coastal recreational species. But it's a fascinating point. There's a real difference in habitat between north of the Cape and south of the Cape. Willie, you talked about that with the biogeography, and how that's going to play out with climate change, I think, is an important question.
And I think just to add on that, Greg, I had mentioned sand eels or sand lance, and there's been a lot of great work occurring up at the Stellwagen Bank National Marine Sanctuary, kind of on a whole bunch of aspects of sand eel biology. And I think one thing they've been looking at is, and I didn't know this, but apparently sand eels need a very specific depth and like sand grain size to do their burrowing and kind of do their thing. And there are concerns that, as conditions change and they have to, go to a new area, will they be able to find those same types of environments? So I think, that kind of thing, I think there might be more opportunities for sure in some cases, but there can also be some contraction and risks occurring from those kinds of movements as well.
Thank you, Greg, Willie, and John. I'm going to turn it over to Dave for the rest of our Q&A session. Take it over, Dave.
Can I ask a quick question, actually? Sorry. Why do you think there isn't that much research on bonito and false albacore? Because they are such a prominent species here, and like we do see changes in the bonito with climate change and stuff. And I've asked a few people this, and everyone has the same answer. Like, there's just not that much information on them. But why do you think that is? Or I don't know.
Willie, you want to go first?
Yeah, I guess I would start and leave it at this by saying I hope that won't be the case for much longer. We'll see. We're certainly hoping to find some potential ways to do some false albacore research. I think, you know, the brutal truth of it, Abby, is that they're not, you know, that they don't really have a lot of commercial value. And so I think traditionally, you know, or food value for that matter. And I think, you know, so traditional kind of funding sources, you know, through NOAA Fisheries or otherwise, are typically more oriented around species that have real tangible values like that. And I think so certainly for a case of studying a primarily recreational fish, which is certainly what those two would fall into, it's really, you know, we need kind of directed recreational funding, and that might have to be private or otherwise. And I'm hopeful that we'll be able to find ways to do it, because I do think there's a need for this kind of empirical research. But I think, you know, they're certainly very important to some sectors of fishermen, of, you know, the recreational catch and release community. But because they don't kind of have, you know, like other species, a bunch of different uses, I think those species often get priority, if that clarifies.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, and I agree 100%. And I think there's a gap, sort of that mid-size, highly migratory species gap. I'd add in sort of bullet and frigate mackerel to that gap as well. And I think, you know, chub mackerel are, you know, there are a lot more chub mackerel around. As I understand it, they move a lot faster than Atlantic mackerel. So there's sort of that mid, highly migratory species gap in our understanding. And yeah, you know, it's from a fisheries management perspective, it's a gap. But I think the other piece to think about it in terms of our understanding of the ecosystem, it's a real gap, because how do those species sort of move, you know, trying not to get too technical here, but how do they move energy through the system? How important are they to the productivity of the ecosystem? I think that you can make the case that their importance is certainly growing. And so we need to look at them in more detail, certainly.
Thank you, John and Willie, for giving us the context of this. I think that it really helps to fill out the stories of what our colleagues in panel one were sharing. Dave, do you want to take it from here, please?
Sure.
I did have a question.
Oh, go ahead, Mike.
So we've been speaking quite a bit about black sea bass and, you know, their migration towards or down the coast. And when we have numbers on biomass for black sea bass within those zones. So years past, when black sea bass really weren't in this area, do we have biomass numbers from, you know, the other states and, you know, Virginia and those areas? Were they as plentiful there then? Or are those fish coming here and becoming, you know, larger masses? You know, do we have numbers on things like that? Is there anything that we have?
Yeah, so I can answer that, you know, first. So yes, there are numbers on that. It kind of goes to that, you know, the distinction I was trying to make about the shifting distribution versus an expanding distribution. So I think if you ask fishermen in sort of Maryland, Mid-Atlantic, you know, they would say they haven't, you know, they haven't seen much change in the biomass of black sea bass. And then in this region, southern New England, we've seen a large increase in biomass. So the evidence is that population is expanding northwards. And then, you know, how that plays out in the fisheries management process is difficult. The states to the south have their allocation, and they have the same number of fish they had in the past. States in the north have a low allocation, but they've got more fish than they had in the past, and that creates that tension in the management system, which I certainly see. I think many of us have experienced that recently at the Mid-Atlantic Council and Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission.
So they're not really decreasing in those other areas as they move into, you know, our areas. They're
correct. It's an expanding, an expanding population and increasing in abundance.
Interesting. Okay. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks, John. That was a great question, Mike. What we'd like to do is sort of wrap it up. We've been we let the question and answer session go, And it went so long that we're not going to break out into smaller groups because it's already 8 o'clock. And I'd just like to remind everyone of the photo contest that we have underway. If you were able to join us just as we were getting started, we were showing some of the fine photos that folks have submitted. We'd like to encourage those submittals right up until April 9th, I believe, or 10th, because we are having a second session on the 13th. So we do have some big prize money for the photos. It's $250, 2 $250 prizes. So please submit those photos. And it's just a matter of sending me an email, and you can actually find that on the landing page for this series. So, and I'd like to just once again remind people, our second session, Effects of Climate Change on Recreational Fishing and Boating, Opportunities and Actions, will take place April 13th. Sort of, it's on a Wednesday, the same time frame from 6:30 to 8. And by all means, if you had some questions and comments, attend that session, because we will definitely try to fit in a question and answer session on that one. And that said, I'd like to thank everyone. I'd like to thank all of our panelists, all of our participants and sponsors, and certainly thank URI, Sea Grant, and Coastal Resource Center and Jen's team for doing a great job. So Jen, is there anything that you'd like to add?
No, I think this was a great session and I'm looking forward to the next one. Thank you so much
Great.
for coming. Appreciate it.